There is an ancient principle in geopolitical strategy. The hemispheric hegemon dies when rival powers establish permanent military presence in its immediate sphere of influence. It's a law of power as immutable as physics. For 100 years since the 1912 American intervention that converted Central America into Washington's backyard, no foreign power maintained military bases in the region. But this week, that century-old monopoly ended. Last Tuesday, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega officially announced that Nicaragua has granted permanent military installation rights to the Russian Federation. Naval facilities in Bluefields on the Caribbean coast, signals intelligence installation in Managua, landing rights for Russian long-range bombers at Punta Huete Air Base. 1,200 Russian military personnel deploying in January 2025. And here's what the corporate media doesn't want you to know. This isn't opportunistic provocation. This is calculated strategic retaliation for 100 years of American intervention that transformed Nicaragua into an economic colony. I'm a former International Monetary Fund analyst. For 12 years, I tracked how economic subordination translates into military occupation. I saw cables about great power competition for Central America. I analyzed projections on Russian reaction to NATO expansion. And what's happening now in Managua isn't an isolated development. It's symmetrical application of American logic. If the United States can expand NATO to Russia's border, Russia can establish bases 1,140 kilometers from the American border. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, flew to Managua twice in 2024. 2 emergency missions. The chief of American diplomacy begging Ortega to reject Russian military offers. Blinken offered sanctions lifting, infrastructure investment, normalization of relations, restored access to the American market. Ortega listened for 90 minutes in the first meeting, then presented Blinken with a list of American interventions in Nicaragua since 1912. Military occupation 1912 to 1933. Support for Somoza dictatorship 1936 to 1979, CIA-funded Contra War 1981 to 1990, economic sanctions 1985 to 1990, and 2018 present. Ortega asked, why should Nicaragua trust American promises when it has a century of betrayal? Blinken had no answer. He signed the agreement with Russia 3 weeks later. Because here's the truth Washington cannot admit. You cannot impose 100 years of military occupation, CIA-backed dictatorships, proxy wars, and economic strangulation, then expect gratitude when a rival power offers partnership without colonial conditions. Let me take you through the systematic American aggression against Nicaragua that created the political imperative for this historic break. Because Nicaragua didn't wake up last Tuesday and casually decide to invite Russian military bases. This is strategic revenge for a century of forced subordination. In 1912, U.S. Marines invaded Nicaragua to protect American banking investments. The occupation lasted 21 years. During this time, the United States controlled Nicaraguan customs to secure debt payments to New York banks. Nicaragua could not establish independent economic policy. American bankers dictated Nicaraguan government budget. By 1925, Nicaragua had paid $53 million, 2024 value, $2.1 billion, to American creditors for loans that financed infrastructure, primarily benefiting American companies extracting Nicaraguan resources. This wasn't development, it was systematized extraction. In 1936, the United States installed Anastasio Somoza Garcia as dictator. The Somoza family would rule Nicaragua for 43 years through brutal repression financed and armed by Washington. Why did the United States support dictatorship? Because Somoza guaranteed that American corporations would have unrestricted access to Nicaraguan resources: gold, timber, coffee, bananas, all exported to the United States at prices controlled by American buyers. During the Somoza regime, Nicaragua transferred approximately $47 billion in inflation-adjusted resource value to American corporations. The Somoza family accumulated a personal fortune of 900 million, while 83% of Nicaraguans lived in poverty. But Nicaragua maintained political stability serving American interests, so the United States called this a democratic alliance. In 1979, the Sandinista revolution overthrew Somoza. The new government implemented land reform, nationalized key sectors, established universal health care and education. These policies reduced American corporate profits, but improved Nicaraguan living conditions. The United States responded by declaring economic war. In 1981, the Reagan administration began financing the Contras, right-wing guerrillas who attacked Nicaraguan civilians, destroyed infrastructure, mined ports. The CIA spent $300 million financing the Contras from 1981 to 1990. 12,000 Nicaraguans died. Infrastructure valued at $8 billion destroyed. In 1986, the International Court of Justice ruled that the United States violated international law by mining Nicaraguan ports. The court ordered the United States to pay $17 billion in reparations. The United States refused to recognize the court's jurisdiction and never paid a cent. Message to Nicaragua: international law doesn't protect small nations from American aggression. In 1985, the United States imposed a complete trade embargo. Nicaraguan exports to the United States fell from $167 million in 1984 to zero in 1986. Nicaraguan GDP contracted 23% from 1985 to 1990. Inflation reached 33,000% in 1988, not due to Sandinista economic incompetence, due to American blockade designed to destroy the Nicaraguan economy through deprivation. In 1990, sanctions and war had so devastated Nicaragua that Sandinistas lost elections to a U.S.-backed coalition promising an end to war and sanctions if Nicaragua elected a pro-American government. Nicaraguans chose peace over principles. The United States called this a democratic victory. But here's what Western media omits. From 1990 to 2006, pro-American governments implemented massive privatization, selling Nicaraguan state assets to foreign corporations for fractions of real value. Telecommunications company Enatel sold for $85 million when worth $400 million. Electric company sold for $200 million when worth $900 million. Buyers: primarily American and Spanish corporations. By 2006, Nicaragua had transferred $11.4 billion in state assets to foreign ownership through forced privatizations. The IMF and World Bank linked loans to these privatizations. Nicaragua could not refuse without economic collapse. In 2007, Daniel Ortega returned to power through democratic elections. He began renationalizing some services, implementing social programs, establishing relations with Cuba, Venezuela, Russia. Recovery of economic sovereignty. The United States responded immediately. In 2018, when protests erupted over Social Security reforms, the United States financed opposition groups with $14 million in democracy assistance. American officials publicly declared support for protesters demanding Ortega's resignation. The U.S. ambassador openly met with opposition leaders. Ortega repressed protests. The United States imposed sanctions in 2018, freezing Nicaraguan government assets, prohibiting World Bank loans, blocking American investment. Sanctions continue today, costing Nicaragua approximately $2.3 billion annually in lost growth. So, what happened? Daniel Ortega faces geopolitical mathematics that make Russian military partnership inevitable. The United States maintains sanctions costing $2.3 billion annually. The United States finances opposition attempting to overthrow his government. The United States blocks international loans. The United States threatens intervention if Nicaragua aligns with American adversaries. Here are the numbers that drove Ortega's decision. Russia offered $1,200 million in defense credit for military modernization. China offered $4.7 billion for an interoceanic canal project that would create 200,000 jobs. Iran offered $600 million in energy investment. Venezuela provides 50,000 barrels daily of oil on concessional terms. Total, $6,550 million in investment and assistance from non-Western powers. Compare with the United States, zero investment, active sanctions costing $2.3 billion annually, threats of intervention. The math isn't close. Ortega chose partners offering real investment over a power punishing him economically while demanding subordination. Observe the strategic impossibility faced by Managua. The United States demands that Nicaragua reject military partnerships with Russia, reject Chinese investment, end relations with Iran and Venezuela. In exchange, the United States offers consideration of future sanctions lifting if Nicaragua implements democratic reforms defined by Washington. Nicaragua calculated that implementing reforms demanded by the United States means surrendering political sovereignty, accepting American electoral oversight, allowing U.S.-funded groups to operate freely, ending social programs, privatizing state services. Essentially, the United States demands that Nicaragua become a client state in exchange for ending sanctions that the United States illegally imposed in the first place. Nicaragua rejected subordination. It chose partnership with powers offering investment without colonial conditionalities. First failed American response: military intervention threats. In August 2024, Pentagon officials leaked to media that the United States was evaluating military options to prevent establishment of a Russian base. Officials cited the Monroe Doctrine prohibiting foreign military presence in the Western Hemisphere. Nicaragua responded by pointing out that the United States has 800 military bases in 70 countries, including multiple bases on Russia's border. If the United States can have bases in Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, kilometers from Russia, why can't Russia have a base in Nicaragua? American logic. We can have bases on your border because we represent democracy. You can't have bases in our region because that's aggression. The hypocrisy was too obvious. American military threats achieved nothing. Second failed response: pressure through the Organization of American States. The United States pressured the OAS to condemn Nicaragua for allowing Russian military presence. 18 Latin American nations refused to support the American resolution. Mexico declared that each sovereign nation determines its own defense policies. Brazil cited the principle of non-intervention. Chile pointed out that the United States maintains bases in Latin America without consulting the OAS. The resolution failed. Nicaragua proceeded with the Russian agreement without regional opposition. Third failed response: economic sanctions intensification. In September 2024, the United States added 32 Nicaraguan officials and 17 state entities to the sanctions list. The U.S. Treasury froze assets, prohibited transactions. Nicaragua shifted financial processing to Russian and Chinese banks operating outside the U.S.-controlled SWIFT system. Nicaragua's trade transactions now flow 93% through alternative payment systems. Expanded American sanctions achieved no impact because Nicaragua had already de-dollarized trade. Fourth failed response: diplomatic isolation campaign. The United States attempted to convince European allies to break diplomatic relations with Nicaragua. Spain, Germany, France all refused. Why? Because Europe faces massive energy costs due to sanctions against Russia and doesn't want additional escalation creating more instability. Europe declared that Nicaragua is an American hemispheric issue. If the United States wants to isolate Nicaragua, the United States can do it alone. Europe won't participate. The irony is absolute. The United States spent 100 years intervening in Nicaragua through military occupation, backed dictatorships, proxy wars, economic sanctions. When Nicaragua finally invited a rival power offering partnership without colonial subordination, the United States claimed the right to veto Nicaraguan security decisions based on the Monroe Doctrine that Nicaragua never accepted. You cannot occupy a country for 21 years, install a 43-year dictator, finance a proxy war that kills 12,000 civilians, impose sanctions that contract the economy 23%, ignore an international court ruling ordering you to pay $17 billion in reparations, then expect that country to reject partnership with your rival when it offers investment and respect. The United States attempted to impose all these policies simultaneously and lost. Now, I want to mention here John Mearsheimer, whose theory of offensive realism predicts precisely this outcome. Mearsheimer argues that great powers seek to maximize their share of world power by eliminating rivals from their region while penetrating rivals' regions. The United States applied exactly this strategy by expanding NATO to Russia's border, despite 1990 promises not to do so. The United States established bases in Poland in 2016, increased presence in Romania, deployed troops in the Baltic states. Each move brought American military infrastructure closer to Moscow. Mearsheimer would predict a symmetrical Russian response: penetrate the American Western Hemisphere by establishing military presence in Central America. Nicaragua provides exactly that opportunity. Russia isn't provoking aggression without cause. Russia is applying American logic symmetrically. Professor Stephen Walt of Harvard has written extensively about balancing imbalance of threat theory. Walt argues that states respond to threats by forming alliances with powers that can counter the threat. Nicaragua faces an existential threat from the United States: sanctions, opposition financing, military threats, economic isolation. Nicaragua balances by inviting Russian military presence that makes American intervention more costly. This is the balancing behavior Walt predicts. Professor Cynthia Arnson of the Wilson Center has documented a century of American intervention in Central America. Arnson shows that each American intervention created lasting resentment that resurfaces when the United States weakens. Nicaragua inviting Russia is the resurgence of resentment accumulated during 100 years of forced subordination. Theory predicted that hegemonic intervention creates blowback. Practice confirmed the prediction. History executed the consequences. American dominance in Central America rests on two pillars. Both are collapsing simultaneously. For 100 years, the United States maintained military hegemony in Central America through direct interventions, CIA-backed coups, training local militaries at the School of the Americas. This military domination ensured that Central American governments aligned foreign policy with American interests. Look at what's happening now. Nicaragua opens a Russian military base in December 2024. Cuba maintains Chinese intelligence facilities since 2019, plus a new Chinese naval base announced October 2024. Venezuela maintains defense partnership with Russia, including Tu-160 bombers operating from Maiquetía. Bolivia signed defense cooperation agreements with Russia and China. Total shift. 4 South American/Central American nations now host permanent non-American military presence. This isn't coincidence. It's strategic coordination driven by recognition that the United States can no longer impose military monopoly through threats because it's overextended in Ukraine, the Middle East, Asia simultaneously. The second pillar is American economic dominance that historically allowed Washington to use market access as leverage for political conformity. During the 20th century, the United States was the largest export market for every Central American nation. That trade dominance translated into political influence. Watch the collapse. China is now the largest trading partner for Costa Rica, Panama, second largest partner for Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. China-Central America trade reached $43 billion in 2023. U.S. Central America trade, $38 billion. China surpassed the United States as trading partner in a region the United States considered a captive market. When China surpasses the United States commercially, political influence follows. Costa Rica switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China in 2007 because China offered investment the United States didn't match. Panama did the same in 2017, El Salvador in 2018, Nicaragua in 2021. Each switch reduces American influence while increasing Chinese influence. Trade erosion drives strategic realignment, allowing Russian military presence. Now watch the emerging alternative security architecture. Russia isn't building a formal alliance network. It's building bilateral relationships with nations facing American pressure. Nicaragua gets defense investment and protection against American intervention. Russia gets a base that threatens American territory symmetrically to the threat of NATO bases in Eastern Europe. Venezuela gets Russian military assistance that deters American intervention. Russia gets access to oil reserves and opportunity to operate near American Gulf of Mexico energy infrastructure. Cuba gets Chinese investment and naval facilities. China gets surveillance capability over the American Southeast and a naval foothold in the Caribbean. Bolivia gets Russian-Chinese defense assistance without American conditionalities. China-Russia get access to Bolivian lithium and strategic position in South America. These aren't isolated transactions. This is coordinated security architecture challenging century-old American monopoly in the Western Hemisphere. China's Belt and Road Initiative has invested $138 billion in Latin American projects since 2005. Every port built, every railway financed, every power grid modernized creates economic dependence translated into strategic access. For 100 years, the United States had a magic trick: economically dominate Central America while militarily threatening opposition. That trick is ending. Are you enjoying this analysis? This is precisely the information that American national security media systematically suppresses, because admitting these facts means acknowledging that century-old hegemony in the backyard has collapsed. If you find this content valuable, subscribe immediately. Join 116,000 viewers waking up to geopolitical realignments that will redefine hemispheric power balances. We're not here to sell Monroe Doctrine propaganda. We're here to explain how a century of intervention created inevitable blowback. And hit that like button. Not for vanity, but because YouTube suppresses content challenging the narrative of American indispensability in the Western Hemisphere. Every like signals that analysis of Russian military penetration in Central America deserves to reach audiences beyond foreign policy circles. Comment your location, city and country. I need to map the audience because a Russian base in Nicaragua affects different regions differently. If you live in the United States, you're witnessing the end of hemispheric military monopoly the Pentagon assumed permanent. If you live in Nicaragua, you're witnessing assertion of sovereignty against a century of subordination. If you live in Russia, you're witnessing symmetrical response to NATO expansion. Share this video with someone believing the Monroe Doctrine protects the Western Hemisphere from foreign interference. Because it doesn't protect. It can't. The power to impose it eroded when the United States overextended globally while losing regional economic dominance. National security establishments count on you being too distracted to notice that Russia is establishing a permanent military base 1,140 kilometers from the American border. Show them you're paying attention. Now let's talk about what a Russian military base in Nicaragua means for your security, your defense taxes, your conflict risk. If you live in the United States, particularly the southern United States, you just experienced measurable degradation of hemispheric security. The Russian base in Bluefields can host attack submarines that threaten Gulf of Mexico shipping routes. The Signals Intelligence Installation in Managua can monitor American military communications across the southern United States. Punta Huete Air Base can accommodate Tu-160 bombers carrying cruise missiles with 3,500-kilometer range, reaching Houston, Miami, Atlanta without refueling. Your missile defense capability requires expansion to cover threats from Nicaragua that didn't previously exist. Your defense budget. The Pentagon is requesting $43 billion additional over 5 years to reposition air defense assets covering approaches from Central America. That money comes from taxes or deficit that drives inflation. You pay for strategic failure, allowing Russia to establish presence in your hemisphere. Your conflict risk. Every war game about U.S.-Russia conflict now must incorporate a scenario where Russia uses Nicaraguan facilities to attack critical American infrastructure. Texas and Louisiana oil refineries, LNG facilities, container ports, all now within range of missiles launched from Nicaragua. Probabilities of military incident between American and Russian personnel increase when they operate 1,140 kilometers apart versus 9,000 kilometers apart. Proximity increases risk of accidental escalation. But here's the critical asymmetry. This doesn't distribute impact equitably. If you live in Nicaragua, your government secured $1,200 million in defense investment, modernizing underfunded armed forces. It secured protection against American intervention because attacking Nicaragua now means conflict with Russia. From the Nicaraguan perspective, this is valuable security guarantee. If you live in Russia, your government secured military presence in the American Western Hemisphere, creating symmetry with NATO presence in Eastern Europe. When the United States complains about a Russian base in Nicaragua, Russia points to American bases in Poland. The American moral argument collapses. Russia gains strategic parity. If you live in China, you're watching Russia execute a strategy China considers for the future. Establish military footholds in the American Western Hemisphere, using nations resentful of American intervention. Nicaragua provides a model China can replicate in Venezuela, Bolivia, potentially others. If you live in Europe, you recognize that American overextension created opportunity for Russia-China to penetrate the Western Hemisphere. Europe facing consequences of American policy demanding NATO expansion while ignoring Russian warnings. Now the United States faces symmetrical consequences. The emerging multipolar security order doesn't mean everyone wins. It means powers competing symmetrically, ending the era of American hemispheric monopoly. For you personally, this requires recalibration of security assumptions. The geographic protection the United States enjoyed for a century due to hemispheric dominance no longer exists. Russia operates military installations 1,140 kilometers from the border. That proximity creates vulnerabilities that didn't exist when American hegemony was uncontested. Understanding security realignments requires reading analysis from Managua, Moscow, Caracas, Beijing, not just Washington. American media frames the Russian base as unjustified provocation. Nicaraguan media frames it as historical justice after a century of American intervention. Both perspectives reveal how power is being redistributed. Your children will study history where the Monroe Doctrine is taught as hemispheric policy, ending in 2024, when Nicaragua opened a Russian military base, demonstrating that the United States can no longer impose military monopoly in Central America. Not in dramatic announcement. In an agreement signed Tuesday. In Russian personnel deploying January. In new strategic reality, making century-old American monopoly in the Western Hemisphere obsolete. You heard the whisper of historical revenge. Now watch the geometry of its execution.